Since the last time we spoke, the vaunted aid package has been passed. 91 billion for 3 different flashpoints of war, $61 billion earmarked for Ukraine. And as if that wasn't enough, we have, and I'm just going to play this very quickly, we have Vladimir Zelensky reporting that the United States and Ukraine are working out a bilateral security agreement that would be over the course of 10 years. And here's what he had to say.
Also, our teams, Ukraine and the United States, are currently working on a bilateral security agreement, and we are already working on a specific text. Our goal is to make this agreement the strongest of all. We are discussing the specific foundations of our security and cooperation. We are also working on fixing specific levels of support for this year and for the next 10 years, including armed support, financial, political, and joint arms production.
So, Scott, talk about this aid package. How is it going to affect the conflict from here on out, especially given reports even from, I believe it was Alexander Sersky, the new head of the armed forces, the butcher of Bakhmut. He said that there is a retreat happening, actually, in many key points on the front line. So how will this aid change this, or what is your take?
Well, in the short term, this aid won't change anything. As been pointed out by a number of people, including Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, and others, Ukraine's real problem right now is a lack of manpower, and no amount of money is going to solve that issue. So, even if the equipment that has been earmarked, I think 13.8 billion of the 60.1 billion is for this military aid, military equipment. Even if all this equipment was released now and it rolled into the front lines now, there's no manpower to man it. The Ukrainians just don't have anybody trained up. They're retreating on the front line, not because of a lack of will to fight, because there's no one left to fight. Brigades that are thrown in suffer attrition, are supposed to be rotated out with fresh brigades, can't be rotated out because there's no fresh brigades. When the Russians break through, brigades that are held in reserve or sent in to counterattack aren't available because they are in the front line elsewhere. And you end up yielding positions that otherwise would have been fought over for weeks. The Ukrainians are yielding them a matter of days. So that's the reality, and there's nothing on the horizon right now that shows that Ukraine's going to be able to resolve this manpower issue anytime soon. There's a desperate need for mobilization taking place, but you don't recruit and train troops overnight. And you're also, Ukraine's behind the 8 ball. In the past, when Ukraine has had to rebuild an army, they've done this several times now. They did it in May and June of 2022. When the bulk of the Ukrainian armed forces were destroyed or neutralized by the Russians during the initial, phase of their special military operation. A lot of people are like, oh, the Ukrainians kicked the Russians, but actually the Russians killed a lot of Ukrainians and effectively destroyed their military. And then the Russians voluntarily withdrew from the positions around Kiev and elsewhere as part of a good faith, effort to show the Ukrainians that they were serious about this Istanbul memorandum that they had negotiated for peace, where they said we would leave territory. So Russians were leaving territory to show this good faith. But the Ukrainian army was destroyed. There were units that took 80% casualties that time. They needed to be rebuilt. And so you get this, $46 billion, new, what's the World War II Lend-Lease agreement. And over the course of the summer, the United States, NATO, and other European nations rebuilt the Ukrainian army, infused 60 to 80,000 men trained in Germany, trained in Poland and elsewhere, along with equipment. And the Ukrainians were able to carry out a counteroffensive against a depleted Russian force that had already started withdrawing from the Kharkiv area. I mean, that's the irony of it. Everybody's like, the Ukrainians recaptured the Russians were leaving. They told the Ukrainians, we're leaving. And half the guys had already left. And so these were undermanned. The Ukrainians attack and the Russians fall back to their, the positions they were going to, and those hold. That Ukrainian army was largely destroyed in carrying out this operation. And so they rebuilt the Ukrainian army again, $22 billion thrown into it. They rebuilt it for the great counteroffensive. The bulk of this army was destroyed during the battles of Bakhmut, where, they threw forces in and people were telling them, don't commit to Bakhmut, just give it to the Russians. Don't waste your troops. Nope. They ground up 60,000 there. Then they ground up another 61,000 or so in their failed counterattack. A total of 160,000 troops were lost. And now they've got nothing left. There's nobody left to rebuild. There's no troops in training. There's nothing. There's no reservoir to draw upon. And yet the Russians now are putting more and more troops. Russians have said that they've rebuilt, mobilized 2 combined arms armies and what they call the Dnieper River Flotilla, which is a division-sized force designed to secure the Dnieper River. These guys have already been recruited and trained. You have, Colonel General Lapin re-emerging on the battlefield. He's a general that fought with great heroics early on in the fighting. He was relieved, under a cloud. I guess he had a difference of opinion with General Surovikin. Sent back, went to the General Staff Academy. They deemed him to be fit for command, and they put him in charge of 100,000 Russians who are now appearing on the front line, ready to commit. This is an offensive-minded general. So, the bottom line is the Ukrainians are on their back heels and backing up further. The second and third lines of defense have been penetrated by the Russians. The Ukrainians don't seem to have the ability to plug these gaps. And eventually, what's going to happen is they're going to have to make a precipitous withdrawal across the entire breadth. And this is something Ukrainians don't want to do because there are still cities that they're holding, towns they're holding in Donetsk that are strong points, heavily fortified, have been fortified for over a decade. And, the Russians haven't made any progress there. And the Ukrainians are loath to give up these fortified positions because they think at a minimum they should force the Russians to pay, a heavy price to take these. But as Russia penetrates the line and starts maneuvering around, these places run the risk of being surrounded. And then the Ukrainians will have no choice but to withdraw from that. And this is what we're starting to see as the Russians shape the battlefield. The equipment that they're going to get, some of it, everybody's talking about the ATACMS missile. Well, the ATACMS missile has been introduced to this battlefield since March. The Biden administration admits that without congressional approval, they went ahead and gave these missiles to the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians have been using them since March. And they continue to use them now, and with some success. But the Russians jam the GPS, guidance system. The Russians shoot down the majority of the ATACMS that are shot. It's not a game-changing weapon. There's no such thing as a game-changing weapon. This 60.1 billion, but only 13.8 is for military assistance. The rest goes to other things, including getting the United States to rebuild equipment, and that's going to take over several years. A lot of this equipment isn't available right now. It has to be procured. It has to be assembled. It's going to unfold over a series of months, and Ukraine doesn't have months. They're running out of time now. And I think you're just going to see the battlefield continue to deteriorate to the detriment of the Ukrainian strategic posture. And there's nothing that the Ukraine could do to stop that.
Yeah, and talk about this retreat that's going on, because Sierski is making it seem like it's tactical, like there's a almost like a directive for this retreat to occur. Yet there are reports also that there's been spotted many Ukrainian troops just running away from the front lines, and even in terms of manpower, there have been Azov fighters who have reported that nobody wants to go. Like, no, not even Azov fighters want to go to the front line. And these are the forces that have been the people that you talk a lot about, Scott, the Banderas, who are so passionate about this cause to supposedly defeat Russia. So can you talk about this retreat that's happening, especially in Donetsk? You said it's heavily fortified. A lot of the reports about the retreat have also been from that location, that very important location, of course, for Russia.
When we, first of all, let's just make it clear when we talk about retreating Ukrainians. I haven't met a Russian officer or soldier yet who will speak disparagingly about the Ukrainians as fighters. Every Russian I've met who's been on the front line speaks very highly of the Ukrainians. They don't agree with their politics. They're actively trying to kill them, but they, to a man, they say these guys fight hard. The Ukrainians fight hard because they're Russians. I mean, for the most part, they're the same people. They're loath to surrender. They fight to the last bullet. They sometimes fight to the last man. They don't want to give up positions. So when a Ukrainian retreats, it means that the situation's really, really gone bad. It takes a lot to get the Ukrainian to retreat. So the mere fact that we're talking about a withdrawal means that the situation has deteriorated, in a horrific manner for the Ukrainians. The way they call this positional warfare. First of all, the amount of artillery and the amount of the mines and anti-tank weapons make, the traditional large-scale massed attacks impractical. So this battlefield, this war, has turned into basically just a series of raids conducted by one another, smaller groupings of infantry backed up by limited numbers of armor, trying to carry out very limited objectives. For instance, securing the next tree line, securing a couple buildings in a village, and then once you secure it, to dig in and then see what the Ukrainians do. Generally, what happens is the Ukrainians will counterattack, and at some point in time, the attacking forces, rather than die, will withdraw. And then the next day, they'll do it all over again. And the idea is that you continue to do that till one side gets exhausted. If the Russians get exhausted, they stop attacking and the line freezes on that. If the Ukrainians get exhausted, the Russians end up taking that corner of the village or that tree line, but now they're exhausted. So they stop, they take a pause, the line solidifies, and they do it again. Now that we have drones, it becomes even more complicated because each side is flooding the zone with drones, which makes the concentration of troops and equipment suicidal. If a drone operator sees 5 guys together, the drone dives in and gets them. And so you're seeing people disperse. You're operating in groups of 2 men, 3 men, smaller groups. That's the way modern battlefields have come in. You don't see large groupings of troops together because that's an invitation to die. And so this battlefield is like that. These groups, these limited attacks, duration attacks. The other thing is, because of drones and artillery, you can't assemble the artillery. For instance, if I was going to put artillery fires in support of an advance, I would bring up my artillery shells sufficient to the task. And then I would have them there. I can fire them off. But nowadays, if I bring up the artillery shells, that damn drone spots it. And now I have a lot of ammo there, and they're going to start firing, hoping to set off my ammunition dump. And when they set off my ammunition dump, my offensive stalls because I no longer have the artillery able to support it. So what instead I do is, instead of looking for the grand breakthrough, etc., I bring up the artillery necessary for very limited advances. That way, I don't suffer overwhelming losses if they get my artillery piece, my artillery ammunition. And it also makes it more difficult for the enemy to see. So everything gets broken down into smaller packets, and the war, still extremely violent, instead of being one large overarching battle, becomes a series of very small engagements all along the front line. Each engagement is life and death for the people participating, but this is the way the war has gone. And that's why it's attritional as opposed to positional, because you're not taking a large amount of territory. The reason why I bring this up is that for Syrskyi to start talking about withdrawals, retreats, that's a deviation. That means that the Ukrainians can no longer maintain that kind of contact, that they have insufficient forces, that as the Russians advance and take a tree line, the Ukrainians can't counterattack. But worse than that, the Ukrainians don't even have troops to fall back on the next line of defense. And so the Russians take the next tree line, then the next tree line. Suddenly they're through the second defensive line into a village, moving up a ridge line. And again, it's all slower because as bad as things are for the Ukrainians, they still have artillery. They still have FPVs. They don't have an overwhelming amount of artillery, but if you give them a target, they're going to hit your target. They're going to take you out. So the Russians are not massing their troops. They're still going very gradual offenses. But as it unfolds, the Ukrainians, they're not stupid, are doing the military math saying the Russians have outflanked us here. We don't have the artillery fire or the troops to commit to this fight to stop this. So we have no choice now. If we don't want to lose these troops down here, we already have a manpower shortage, so we can't throw away troops. We're going to have to start withdrawing troops to basically consolidate the lines. If you have a line that's, like this, if you have a straight line, it takes less forces to deploy along that straight line. As soon as you start throwing curves, you have more area, and so you have to deploy more forces. So sometimes to hold, this section of ground, it takes twice as many troops because you've got curves in the line. And so what will happen sometimes when you need to conserve forces, you need to fall back so that you remove the bulges, remove the curves, straighten out the line. And then your troops now can get the appropriate concentrations. And the Ukrainians right now are looking at this line that the Russians are turning into this big curvy mess that the Russians are able to man, but the Ukrainians can't. And Syrski's talking about a tactical withdrawal to more defensible positions. The problem, though, is that, well, it may look like a tactical withdrawal. If once they get to those new defenses, they don't have the ability to freeze the battle there and hold the Russians at bay, they're going to have to withdraw again. And suddenly, if you've done a series of tactical withdrawals, it starts to look like a strategic withdrawal. And I think we're right now in the initial part of what I believe will be a series of tactical withdrawals, in effect, a strategic withdrawal. And that's what we're looking at. The Russians have hinted to me that something big is going to happen that's going to dramatically change the map of the battlefield. And I think what you're going to be looking at is that the Russians are going to start to make major gains in recovering the totality of the Donbass, recovering the Zaporizhia, threatening Kharkiv. You're going to start seeing that. And then once that happens and they get on the Dnieper River, and the Russians can consolidate their lines, a reconcentration of troops, Mykolaiv, the rest of Kherson, Odessa. And I think this is what we're going to be seeing through the summer. If Syrski wants to call that tactical withdrawal, so be it. It looks like a strategic retreat to me.
Yeah, well, maybe you can speak to then, given that this feels like dominoes are kind of falling and Russia is methodically pushing the dominoes over when it comes to Ukraine, what will then 10 years, now Zelensky and the United States are supposedly in these talks for a 10-year bilateral security agreement. What could this possibly accomplish, given that the situation right now is looking very grim? The aid that has been pushed through is likely not going to change anything or even prolong the situation further to a certain degree. So what will this accomplish then if the United States and Ukraine come to some kind of 10-year bilateral security agreement?
Well, let's keep in mind that this past security agreement was passed by Congress in the fall, and it was supposed to be dispersed in the fall. Excuse me. And we are, coming up on 6 months later, and it's cost Ukraine dearly. It was held hostage by American politics, by presidential politics, to be precise. The border security became an issue, and the Republicans in the Congress hijacked this supplemental funding package, saying that they weren't going to release money for Ukraine, for Taiwan, for Israel, without money also being allocated to the security of the southern border. And the Democrats were saying, well, we already have a good border plan. They didn't want to admit defeat. So it became a political problem, and the money was held hostage until the Iranians and Israelis changed the dynamic of the discussion with their tit-for-tat retaliatory potential expanding to a greater war issue. And suddenly, from a political perspective, in order to assuage Israel, to keep Israel from launching a major attack against Iran that could trigger an Iranian counter response and then a war, we needed to release this money. And so Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, broke the supplemental up into its various components. These components were voted on single and then brought back together and passed. But it was only because of domestic politics, because of a change in the foreign policy calculus that suddenly said, we have to get that Israeli money out. But you couldn't have the Israeli money linked to the Ukrainian money or the Taiwanese money. It had to be voted on to Israel. Once you took the Israeli money out, you might as well split the stuff up, Mike Johnson's reasoning. And it happened. They voted on it. They all three passed by good majorities. And now the money is there. But now you're Ukrainian and you're also the Biden administration. Look, the Biden administration has to be realistic at this point in time. There's a chance that Biden isn't going to be reelected. But even if he is, it would be for 4 years, and and he'll be challenged. The Democrats will be challenged at the end of the 4 years. It's going to be very tough. You're probably looking. You're either going to get a Republican presidency this time around, or you're going to get a Republican presidency 4 years from now. Now, do you want to admit that Ukraine has been defeated, that this is the last supplemental that's been passed? There will be no more supplementals. You can't do that. But do you also want future supplementals to be held hostage by domestic American presidential politics? Because no matter what, as soon as this election's over in November, we're going to immediately jump into, looking to 2028, and and things, we're talking about a whole new set of political players. We don't know how Congress is going to react, et cetera. So what the Biden administration is trying to tell Zelensky and the Europeans, because a lot of this is about mollifying European concerns who watch $61 billion be held up and Europe sort of left standing alone. The idea is to have a 10-year commitment that would be very difficult, if not impossible, for a president to overturn. It allows for predictability. It allows for sustainability. But the whole idea is to remove American domestic politics from the equation so that we don't have a situation going down where the United States Congress holds military aid for Ukraine hostage. Now, this is all fine and dandy. I mean, it's nice to live in a fantasy world. And Zelensky and anybody in the Biden administration that's talking about this is living in a fantasy world, one that assumes that Ukraine is going to survive the summer, and that Ukraine will be in a position going forward to continue, meaningful resistance against the Russians. But they tend to forget that. I know they hold peace conferences in Switzerland where they don't invite the Russians, and so the world's become accustomed to talking about things that deal with the Russians without actually having the Russians involved. But the reality is, the Russians alone will determine when this war ends and how this war ends and under what conditions. Not Zelensky, not the president. So they can sign whatever agreements they want. First of all, there's no guarantee the U.S. Congress will go along with this. I mean, does Congress really want to abrogate its responsibilities of oversight and give the executive branch, and not just this executive branch, but to be holding other executive branches hostage to an agreement that they can't overturn? That's the intent. I don't see Congress doing this. So I think right now what we have is a lot of
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyHaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.